And the Corinthian in Rebel Hill, Tripoli, was not secure. There was more soldiers there than there were before, and there was fighting, and they fought themselves. Let me tell you, I stayed at the Radisson Blu Al Mahari, okay? Its original name was Al Mahari, then it got bought and it became Radisson Blu Al Mahari. So I stayed at the Radisson Blu, and the Radisson Blu is, for all I know, has been turned into an interrogation headquarters by the USA, by CIA and NATO. You know, they're essentially calling the shots, and they're taking people and interrogating them, and they're being shot, you know, in the rooms. Like, it's an interrogation office now. It's Khalifa Haftar's headquarters, okay? And Khalifa Haftar is the CIA asset that was sent there, and he's the one who's running the armed forces right now, the Transitional Council's armed forces, the rebel armed forces, or the revolutionary armed forces. So that's what happened to that hotel. That was my hotel. The Swiss Inn Al Nasser or Rexis Al Nasser was not my hotel. I was stuck there. I was stuck there, and I was aware, and I was telling colleagues we have to leave because the security situation is becoming bad, and I was very aware of that before this all happened, because they were putting pressure and making people feel hopeless, and that there was no victory for them. You know, they gave in to these fears, and when they gave in to these fears, some started to defect, and they arranged a defection. And I believe that one of the key defections they arranged was with one of Gaddafi's relatives, who was in the Libyan military. And he was in charge of the Western Mountains. And what he did is he told his forces to leave their fortifications. And what this did is it opened up the highway from the Western Mountains. These aren't large groups we're talking about. You know, the combatants on both sides are a maximum of 20 to 25,000 people. Okay? Both sides put together. 20 to 25,000, maybe 35,000 maximum. That's very generous. It's an exaggeration, in fact. So the highway was opened from the Western Mountains, which is close to Tripoli, on the western side of Libya, and it goes all the way to the border with Libya's neighbors in the west. And the highway was open to the coast, and they drove through Surman all the way to Zawiya. When they went to Zawiya, they tried to take over the oil refinery. And by the way, Al Jazeera had embedded reporters with them, who really manipulated their reports, you know, because they didn't take over Zawiya. I know that, and the Al Jazeera reporters even fell back into their original positions. They were still talking about Zawiya. What they did is they went to Zawiya, and this is when panic started to arise. Because when they went to Zawiya, they cut the road off to Tripoli. They essentially almost completed a siege of Tripoli, you know, preventing food into the city. And this is when things began to snowball, you know. So the whole point of what they did was to create a siege around Tripoli. So prevent food from coming, currency from coming, water from coming, fuel from coming, medication from coming in. So they would cause Tripoli to implode. This was part of the tactic. They wanted an implosion, and if you read their strategy papers, which I do, they do talk about, we can't militarily take over Tripoli, we need a peaceful implosion. So this is what they did, and it caused defections and panic, like I said. And while they were doing this, NATO began to carpet bomb. And when they began to carpet bomb, after the carpet bombing, they bring in the insurgents. So it was not really the insurgents who came in. Like, you know, they're going to get upset if you take the credit away from them, because, you know, they did fight. But in reality, it was the carpet bombings. Because NATO was sending helicopters into Tripoli. And there's some people who say this is not true. But I know very well that those people are not only misinformed, they're giving misinformation. You know, they used Apaches and helicopters, and they deliberately attacked the civilian checkpoints. Okay? The checkpoints were mostly manned by volunteers. Some were by police, militia, and military, but most of them were volunteers. And they deliberately attacked these checkpoints. You know, those checkpoints were for security. They were no threat to civilians, because they're not even mobile checkpoints, you know. They're stationary, they don't move, they're there to make sure no arms come in or nothing bad comes in, there's no terrorism. So the NATO's argument here, you can see it's false, it's a fallacy. They attack the checkpoints with the helicopters, and they open the road, and now there's fighting in Tripoli, and who suffers? The Libyan people suffer. while their country's wealth is stolen, while their culture is being destroyed, while they're, you know, it's during times of shock and war that you can reconfigure a society, and that's what's going to happen to the Libyans. Politically, economically, and culturally, that country's going to have a facelift, and it's going to be remolded, you know, into a colony. But the fighting's not over, because the Libyan government's still there. I want to tell you that. They're making it sound like it's game over. It's not game over yet at all.
Absolutely. I certainly get that impression from the reportage that we hear coming out of the mainstream. It sounds like it's a foregone conclusion, and they've already set up their transitional council, and they're having the Friends of Libya meeting in Paris and all of that. But it certainly seems that they're still bombing, so there must still be resistance. And that's just one aspect of what you talked about before, the psychological war that's going on to really convince the Libyans and the people, I guess, in the NATO countries that are at least tacitly supporting these bombings that the fighting is over. But tell us some more about the reportage that you had firsthand witness to from some of the mainstream organizations that were clearly reporting falsehoods and untruths.
Okay, well, I can tell you right now, there's a lot of politics in the language the media uses, because it has a psychological effect on the reader and the listener and the viewer. For example, when they called the legitimate military of Libya, the Gaddafi forces, or pro-Gaddafi forces, this is stripping them. This strips them of their title and their role in the country. They use this language. There's a lot of political language, right? And since I am speaking about the journalists, I want to say that there are good people amongst them. Some people that are caught in a lifestyle they don't want to be in, but underneath it all they have their doubts and their regrets, you know, and they're not as bad as some people think, some of them. And I want to make a differentiation here between spies and intelligence agents and security officials, because there are journalists who are there in a security context, but that is to protect the other journalists, okay? They're there for protecting the other journalists. One asks, why would you need other journalists protected? You know, that's a good question in itself. But there are some of them that are just there strictly to protect the other journalists, and their job is security. It's not there to steal information or things like that, and they're called field producers. You know, they give them another job, like taking photos, for example. But they're also there to protect the other journalists, and it's a serious question of why they're there, you know. Why do they need to protect the other journalists? That's a question in itself, you know. But some of those people are good people. You know, they only came there to protect the other people. I'll tell you right now, the BBC, for example, had one of these. The gentleman, he was in charge of all the security, in fact. And it was very interesting to see how all the networks are integrated when it comes to security. There's an actual hierarchy, and it shows that there's actual collaboration. But the man who led this, I have a lot of respect for, and I don't think he was a bad person at all. And I saw the professionalism he carried himself through. Might be criticized for this, but this is my feeling on the ground. You know, whatever I think of the BBC and what it's done in Libya, which is horrible, and they've been involved in lies. You know, for example, they show footage of Indians and they claim it's Libyans, you know. I think he was a good person. On an organizational point of view, I think CNN was in charge of everybody, because the CNN producer was basically the leader for everybody. And you see how everything's patched up. It's part of it's actually, they're all integrated. It's like an integrated system from my perspective of what I saw on the ground. Anyways, despite the tensions and I've spoken to you, and people know about my reporting from there, what was going on. I don't want to. I like to see some of these journalists, you know, start new lives afresh. I'd like to say something positive like that, you know, because they are human beings. And like I said, I had some really frank conversations with some people there. I said, look, this is not a lifestyle to have. Look what your reporting has done. Look what it's done. We have to build a better world. That's what we're all here for. We're not here to, you know, look at all the people who have died. Is it really worth it? I felt like I had a good heart-to-heart with some of them. You know,
Absolutely.
we didn't know how it was going to go, James.
Mm.
We didn't know who was going to die, who was not going to die.
Well, I think your point is well taken. Certainly, I doubt that the BBC only hires evil people or something like that. Certainly, I think there are a lot of good people who work for these organizations, just as there are good people on both sides of the Libyan conflict and bad people on both sides. And again, it's just human beings interacting, but there's things going on at the institutional and organizational level that directs what's happening. But unfortunately, our connection's starting to break up a little bit, so perhaps we can start to wind this conversation up. But I wanted to also, I guess, touch on any other aspects of this that you think it's really important for people to understand who might only be getting their news from the mainstream channels or may not have been following your reporting. What are some of the important points you wanted to touch on?
Well, look, the media nowadays is part of a huge integrated machine. And it's directly linked to the military and foreign policy. You cannot forget this. And I'm not saying this as media in North America or the NATO countries. This is everywhere. You cannot forget this, and you have to think critically, but you also need diversity in the news you read. You have to take ownership for what you listen to. What you pick to listen to. Diversity will always help, and you should listen to both sides of the argument before you decide. I've openly said this, I'm a fallible person. I make mistakes. I've made mistakes my whole life. So I actually told a friend the other day, you know, I spend most of my life fixing my mistakes and doing other things. But you have to see both sides of the argument and make a decision for yourself. That's what it comes down to. And you have to be really open-minded, and you can't lose focus of the fact that the media is deeply involved in perception management. That's the truth. And you know, everybody has to know that war is never a solution for anything. That's essentially what I have to say.
Absolutely. Well, just so many incredible experiences that you must have had, so I'm sure we'll have you back again in the future to continue talking about that and the other work that you're doing. But Mahdi Nazemroaya, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, and it's a pleasure to have you back in Canada safe and sound. So thank you again so much for taking the time to talk with us today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.